Hi there, welcome back. We are on the second part of insect diversity. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. You know the routine. Okay. All right. So today, the second part of this lecture, we're just going to talk about this group called Ecdysozoa, which seems simple, but there's a lot of critters in this group. And there are your questions for this lecture. All right. PowerPoint doesn't like to move at first. I understand that feeling. Next. Okay, so remember this table. This is a table that I'm using to help you guys to keep track of what you minimally should know about these groups and also their relationships to each other. So we're in Eumetazoa and we're also in Bilateria. So these are all animals that are triploblastic, all animals that have bilateral symmetry. We talked about Lophotrogozoa in the first part. Now we're going to talk about Ecdysozoa. And we're going to shortchange nematode worms. I mentioned them to you in the beginning of the first part as this group that are not very spectacular to look at, but they're really diverse in terms of their ecologies and functions. And we have a department of nematology at UCR. No, that's not on the exam. It's just to help you remember these things. All right, so they like other Ecdysozoa, which is where the name comes from, undergo ecdysis, which is molt, and we'll deal with that in more detail with the arthropods. All right. Oh, and nematodes are pseudocoelomates. You should know that one. All right, arthropods are coelomates. They have a true body cavity and they have a segmented body, and I'll show you what I mean by that in distinction from what we talked about with annelid worms, which also have segmented bodies, and they have jointed appendages and they have an exoskeleton that's made of protein and chitin. Okay, so back to this pie that I showed you guys before is kind of just a visual sense of the relative diversity of these groups that we're talking about today. And so we're talking about invertebrates, which is everything here. But specifically, now that we're talking about arthropods, this includes all the true insects and also arachnids, which includes spiders and scorpions, and crustaceans, which includes things like crabs and lobsters and friends. And it also includes centipedes, though those are they're not a big enough group to go on this pie. They're just a tiny slice of the pie. But really the point is that this is an incredibly diverse group in terms of species numbers. And so as I showed you on one of the first slides in the first part of this lecture, there's more than 1 million extant arthropod species, and most of them, as you just saw from that pie, are indeed insects. And the estimated number of undescribed species of arthropods is literally astronomical. It's like 1 billion billion, which is just unimaginable. And I don't know how these numbers are estimated, but again, it's kind of the exciting part of science. Think about what's left to describe. And insects alone have more described species than all other eukaryotic groups combined. So this is including protists, including plants, fungi, and all other animals. So pretty remarkably high diversity. And so before we look at some of the characteristics of some of these groups, it's worth asking more generally, why is it that arthropods are so diverse? What explains their phenomenal diversity when other groups, like the group that centipedes belong to, are not nearly so diverse? All right. So this is not the answer, but J.B.S. Haldane was an evolutionary biologist who was very smart and a bit of a wise ass to boot, and also an atheist. And so the story goes that he was talking in a pub, he was English, to a theologian, And the theologian knew that he was an evolutionary biologist, and that evolutionary biologists were interested in the diversity of life on Earth. And so the theologian asked JBS Haldane what he made of, basically having studied the creator's production, right? All the species on Earth. And JBS Haldane is said to have said that he assumed that the creator had an inordinate fondness for beetles. And what he meant by that is that there are many, many, many species of beetles. Okay, a more serious answer to the question here. This is part of it. So if you remember from the first lecture, arthropods were the first animals to colonize land, and this is huge. So about 450 million years ago, so this is still in the early Paleozoic, and there's pretty clear advantages to being the first organisms to colonize a whole new habitat, and those are kind of illustrated here. And so this is just another of my, I like artist renditions of prehistoric times. And again, this is showing the high stress environment for any prey species that was going on in the ocean. And so getting out of that environment into a completely new competitor and predator-free one was obviously beneficial in terms of the diversification of arthropods. And because plants were there first, they could exploit all these new food sources and diversify into all these empty ecological niches. So that's one of the major reasons why we think that arthropods are so diverse, that they kind of got a head start on other animals in terms of colonizing land. There are other reasons besides that they've evolved this body plan that, like other bilateria, it's bilaterally symmetrical, but it's a segmented body, and segmented body in arthropods refers to these distinct body parts that are combined together, and this allows for specialization of those different body parts. And so they have these paired jointed appendages, as illustrated here in an arthropod lobster, which is also a crustacean. They have their exoskeleton, which provides protection from desiccation and predation, but it's also really important because it provides a place for muscles to attach, facilitating greater mobility. And they also have really well-developed sensory organs. Okay. So moving through the arthropods, the first group is the chelicerates. And chelicerates are spiders, ticks, mites, scorpions, and horseshoe crabs are the ones you need to know. There are others. And horseshoe crabs are just really remarkable to look at. They look, if you've seen pictures, as you now have, of what was going on during the Cambrian explosion in the Paleozoic, they look like something that would have been flopping around in the warm oceans of the Paleozoic. And in fact, we know from the fossil record that they have changed very, very little over that remarkable amount of time. And so they're pretty cool. They're one of the sole surviving marine chelicerates. So animals evolved in the ocean, as did life. And so they're one of the few that have remained in the ocean. But they're not a very diverse group. Apparently the textbook talks about, there was a chelicerate relative of horseshoe crabs that was a kind of scorpion-like, that was like a meter long and apparently could walk on land. And it's nice that we're not around at that time. However, arachnids do include the scorpions that we have today, and spiders, ticks, and mites. And so arachnids are characterized by having 6 paired appendages, and these are characteristics that you should remember. So one of these pairs are chelicerae, and this is where the group chelicerates gets its name from, and these are specialized as pincers or fangs, and so you can't really see them here. Well, I guess you could see them a little bit here. on either the scorpion or the spider. And then they have one pair of pedipalps, and these are specialized structures for their sensory apparatus, and also for specialized in some cases for reproduction, feeding, defense, and so on. In the great example is the scorpion. And then they have 4 pairs of walking legs. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 total, right, on both sides. And so this contrasts with insects, which we'll talk about shortly. So a key thing to remember that is easy to forget, I think, is that spiders are not insects. They are chelicerates, or more specifically arachnids, but they are not true insects. Okay, the second group is the much less diverse group, the myriapods, and myria means many, pod is foot. So they have many feet, and these are the millipedes and the centipedes. Their names also reflect the fact that they have many feet, although the names are not accurate. So millipedes do not have 1,000 legs, and centipedes also don't have 100 legs. But it's true to say that centipedes have fewer legs than millipedes, so I guess if you're going to call them centipedes and millipedes, millipedes are more deserving of the name. So they have very different ecologies. Millipedes they're much larger versions of them than we have today, were the ancestors of the first arthropods to colonize land. And they feed, as they did then, on decaying plant matter, whereas centipedes are carnivores, and they have poison claws that are used to defend themselves and to paralyze their prey. So they make a living in very different ways. They're characterized by lots of legs and feet, and they're each other's closest relatives. Okay. All right. So now we get to this really big group. So it used to be, before we did molecular phylogenies, that crustacea and insects were grouped as 2 separate clades that are each other's closest relatives. But with molecular phylogeny, we've discovered that some insects are more closely related to some crustaceans than they are to other insects, and vice versa. And you don't need to worry about that, but this is to explain to you why we have this big group called pan-crustaceans that you should know actually contains crustaceans and insects. And so pan-crustacea, pan is like all across, so crustacea wide. It is a monophyletic group, but crustaceans and insects are not monophyletic groups. So starting with crustaceans, they have these paired appendages that I've already told you about and illustrated with the lobster here that have these multiple functions. And I'm going to tell you about 4 groups, major groups of crustaceans that you should know. And the first one is perhaps the easiest to remember. These are the decapods. These are the largest ones, and they basically include things that you could, if you chose to, eat. Things like shrimp, lobsters, crayfish, crabs, and so on. And they have up to 19 specialized pairs of paired appendages. And so this is, again, kind of illustrated in this lobster here, that they have these specialized swimming appendages back here, and then the walking legs, and the mouth parts, and the pincers, and the antennae. They got a lot going on. And they have a head, thorax, and a tail. Okay, and you can see the segments here, and you can see that in contrast to something like an earthworm and a annelid worm, where the segments are all identical to each other, each of the segments that make up the body of this example lobster are distinct from each other, so each one is slightly different. Okay. All right, so the second group of crustaceans you should know are copepods, and these are tiny. They're usually planktonic. If you remember, that means that they're kind of free-floating, weakly swimming in the water column. And these include krill, which are kind of famous for being the food that the largest animal, extant animal, feeds on, the blue whale. and other baleen whales feed on these tiny, tiny marine crustaceans. Okay, number 3 are isopods. You may have met pill bugs before. So most isopods are really tiny and they're found in a variety of environments, but, and you don't have to remember this, but this is just to show you that not all isopods are tiny. And so this cutie pie is, I think, like a deep marine isopod, and it's referred to as a giant isopod because it's a foot long. Yeah, it's pretty cute. Okay, all right, number 4, we have a very cool group for the barnacles. And so barnacles, until people really looked at them properly, which actually started with Darwin. Charles Darwin studied barnacles. It was originally thought that they were mollusks because superficially they look like things that have shells, right? So they look kind of like clams and whatever, oysters and friends. But they also have these 2 free swimming larval forms. And again, if you're looking at these adult forms and thinking, do they really have bilateral symmetry? You can look at the larval forms and see that they most definitely do. And the larval forms are kind of beautiful. And this is not in your textbook, and I don't think you need to know the names of these 2 forms, but you should know that they have free swimming larval forms. And so they have this first stage called nauplius, and this is a form that's feeding and swimming around. And then they have this form called cyprus, that these are all really tiny, right? But they're kind of beautiful because their job is basically this life stage to find a place to settle down and stay there. And so they're basically, their structures are just purely for swimming, and they have these kind of angel-like look like wings, but they're for swimming. And then adult barnacles, as you're more familiar with perhaps, are the stage where they settle down and build a house of calcium carbonate around their soft bodies and reproduce. And barnacle reproduction is quite spectacular. I'm not going to show it to you here, but if you choose to Google it, it's quite remarkable. Because if you think about it, they reproduce as adults, right? And here they are, these separate organisms next to each other that can't really move. So it's quite spectacular. And incidentally, these are barnacles that are specialized for living on whales. And so this is, I think, a humpback whale. All right. So, and a thing to remember is that barnacles are not mollusks. And I've showed you these larval forms to help you remember that. Okay. All right, on to the insects. As I showed you in that pie, the insects are incredibly diverse, and we're going to massively shortchange them given their diversity, but I'm going to tell you kind of main features that you should know. So here we go. So they have 3 main body sections: the head, thorax, and abdomen. This stuff is illustrated on a grasshopper here. And then they have 3 pairs of legs, contrasting with 4 pairs of walking legs in arachnids, right? And so that makes 6 total, 3 on each side. And so in this grasshopper, we've got 1, 2, 3, and some of them are modified for specialized function, for, in this case, jumping. Okay. And the majority, not all, but the majority of insect species are also capable of flight. And so they've evolved wings that don't come at a cost of basically sacrificing walking legs. And so the wings are kind of an extra thing. And this is in contrast to when we talk in a little bit about vertebrates. And so the 2 flying vertebrates are birds, of course, and also bats. And in both cases, in different ways, they have sacrificed their forelimbs to become wings, right, to be able to fly. But insects have not done this. And certainly the capacity of many insects to fly has also provided them the opportunity to diversify, and in part explains their extraordinary diversity, right? Because you can exploit a whole bunch of new ecological niches once you can fly, as illustrated by this bee. Okay, the last thing I will say about insects is that many species undergo some form of metamorphosis, and this is not what Kafka was on about human turning into a roach. This is about a young adult, a young juvenile form developing into an adult. And there are two types of metamorphosis, and one is called incomplete because it's not, I guess, really is sort of dramatic in terms of the change that the animal goes through. So a generic example here is a grasshopper, but this is also true for dragonflies and aphids and cicadas, termites, and roaches, as was inspired Kafka, but yeah. And so basically the young hatch in this kind of miniature version of the adult, but then they go through these molts until they reach adult size. Remember that we are in the clade ecdysozoa, and this is a clade that is characterized by molting throughout development. Just as nematode worms do, so do insects and also crustaceans. Okay, but then the other type of metamorphosis is kind of the more spectacular and magical, that is characterized by butterflies and moths. And so the young hatch as larvae that are caterpillars and butterflies and moths, and can be quite attractive on their own. But then they kind of lock themselves away in this pupa where all this insane development is happening, and they emerge in a form that is completely different from what the larval form looked like, that in the case of butterflies is this beautiful adult. But just to bring this down a little bit, it's not just butterflies and moths that undergo complete metamorphosis. So another example is if you've, I don't know what pets you would feed mealworms to, maybe if you have birds, some reptiles eat mealworms. Anyway, they're kind of something you can get in a pet store. But the adult form, they're the larval form of a beetle called a darkling beetle. And so they too, maybe not quite as magically, but they too undergo complete metamorphosis. So from this larval form that you might feed to your pets, and they pupate just as butterflies and moths do, and they emerge as the majestic adult darkling beetle. Okay, so we will stop there. Oh my goodness, I'm spoiling the plot. Okay, so I'm going to stop share and stop recording, and I will see you guys on Friday.